Hello! Today's stories come from r/MaliciousCompliance. We've got 4 stories today, the first of which is a special event. The first ever story submitted and written by a subscriber, Kay Davis. The title is I Can't Fire a Thief? Just Watch Me. My malicious compliance story. Bit long. I worked at a small company, about a dozen people. We had both wholesale and retail operations. I was the office manager and accountant for the retail side and helped the senior accountant who was on the wholesale side. We needed a new receptionist order taker for retail, so I interviewed and hired a young woman who had a fun personality. We will call her Susie. Turns out, I went to school with her dad, but only knew him by name. Susie also had a part time job at a local drugstore chain at the cosmetic counter. We had 2 salesmen, and she would bring them bottles of aftershave and such, claiming they were discontinued. After Easter brought in candy, saying the store was throwing it out. I was already getting suspicious. Susie was always trying to butter up everyone. One day, she brought in a small box, a white noise generator. A week or 2 later, she claimed it was missing. She firmly implied that someone must have stolen it. Out of those dozen people, they had been there for years, and no way would they have taken it. Our warehouse guy took care of the cleaning, so there was no outside cleaning staff. For days, she pouted. Now, my suspicion is up more. Susie's kind of hinting we should pay for it. Susie was a temp to hire after 90 days. Unfortunately, about that time, the senior accountant got brain cancer and had to leave. Being gone so much and sick when she was put us in a mess, and we had to scramble as our account receivables had grown too big. No problem, the companies were all good for it, but she wasn't there to warn us. So we ended up delaying hiring Susie by 1 month, past the normal 90-day hire. She accepted the job and pointed out that by delaying a month, she had to pay an extra month of Cobra health insurance for $500, and it wasn't fair to her. My boss, the general manager of retail, and the owner both agreed to pay it, provided she brought in proof of the bill. A couple days later, she brings in an invoice from a law firm. Susie had said prior to us she worked for a firm that did credit and background checks on people applying to rent apartments. Susie presented the invoice. It had a fax header from the law firm to Susie. It made no sense. I called the law firm and talked to the office manager. Later, the office manager got back to me. One of the lawyers was a partner in the apartment credit check company. Susie had called a clerk at the law firm she barely knew. She was also named Susie. Seems our Susie told the other Susie she just started at a new company and needed an invoice template. And could the other Susie fax it to her, a blank invoice? The other Susie said no problem and did that. The office manager law firm was quite upset and said their Susie would be hearing about this. She also hinted our Susie had been fired for some kind of illegal dealings. I then called the temp agency we hired her from and checked with the local junior college to see if she had really graduated. Turns out she attended, but never graduated. Susie saw I was making odd phone calls, and I could see a look of worry on her face as she tried to get close enough to hear my conversations. I told the general manager, and he discussed it with the owner. The general manager told me not to fire her. This was the owner's decision. He and the owner would talk to her the next day. If she owned up to her actions, she could stay. I didn't like that. There was just too much else against her, such as her missing white noisemaker. Next morning, there was just myself and one of our salesmen, an older guy who thought Susie walked on water. Him and I hadn't been getting along lately. I had to write a 200-page memo explaining he miscounted some commissions he thought were due. Most were due next month. Susie comes in, and I ask her to come into my office and sit down. I closed the door, but left it open enough the salesman could hear every word. I knew he'd strain his best to hear all. I told Susie about the fake invoice, my discussion with the law firm, and the junior college. At this point, Susie is in a panic. She said she'd do anything to keep her job. I also told her she was in luck. The owner said I couldn't fire her and she'd be given a second chance. She sighed relief. I then said the owner said nothing about taking her to lunch. I was going to take her to her required lunch. We would be having a third guest. Her choice, a deputy from the sheriff's department or an FBI agent. I was also bringing the faxed invoice, as that was clearly a case of wire fraud. So, I asked, which guest was she choosing? She got out of her chair, typed up a quick letter of resignation, probably the only time she actually typed her claim of 42 words per minute. Look on the salesman's face was priceless. I later heard from someone in high school her family had kicked her out years before for stealing. Once a thief, always a thief. Isn't it amazing how difficult it can be to get rid of a problem employee? I mean, I get why the protections exist because sometimes it's the employer acting horrible. But other times, you have an employee literally stealing things from the office and committing fraud. And in those cases, you get creative. And when you can do it creatively while remaining professional, you have a good story of malicious compliance. Thanks, Kay Davis. It's great to hear of this type of ingenuity from a listener. Our second story is the time the airline I worked for lost thousands because they didn't want to pay me $10.50. So, the year before the pandemic in the US, I started working for one of the major airlines at my local airport as a baggage handler. I absolutely love the job. I just enjoyed being around planes from the ground level. When I started, there were no full time positions available, so I was working part time, 6-hour nights, 5 times a week. The way it usually works is each gate has a lead, a person with extra training to do the load planning and scanning and towing the planes to the runway, as well as guiding them in, and a few baggage handlers. Now, I had only been there for a few months, but I was working my butt off and showing that I was a team player. I decided I was going to try to become a lead, even though they usually want you to work a year or so as a handler first. I was confident and ended up passing the training course with ease. The problem was they had no availability for more leads, so I was put into what was basically an on call lead kind of thing, where they could upgrade me for the day if they needed more leads. Now, whenever they upgrade you to lead, even if it's for a single flight, they have to pay you the extra $1.75 hour leads get for your whole shift. Remember, I work 6-hour days, so $10.50 is the cost to make me a lead for my shift. Now, for a few months, everything was great. I was part time baggage handler, but I was working as a lead for my whole shift every shift, and I was loving every second of it. Something about towing huge planes full of people to the runway was just awesome to me. Enter everyone's favorite virus, good old vid. Within months, the airline industry is tanking pretty hard as nobody wants to travel and get stuck somewhere. Supervisors are being told to cut costs everywhere they can, which makes sense given the circumstances. Cue up the night of my malicious compliance. It's maybe 11 p.m., and I'm on till 1 a.m. Supervisors have sent a large chunk of workers home, and those of us left are being sent all over the airport to cover the flights we do still have coming in. I get a call from the office that assigns your flights, and I'm told to go grab a box and a walkie. The stuff needed to plug into the plane to talk to the flight deck. They tell me, head to the gate, the flight's landing in 5, and to just put in my request for lead. When asked to be a lead, you put it in on the company app, and a supervisor approves your pay raise for the day. I get to my gate, check the load coming off the plane, brief the handlers on what's coming down, and we all get to our spots to bring the plane in. I see the plane coming down the lane to my gate, and at the same time, my zone supervisor drives up to my gate and asks me to come over. He then tells me something along the lines of, "Hey man, we can't upgrade you to lead right now. We just can't swing that extra expense right now." I respond with, "Okay, so who's going to bring this plane in if nobody else on the gate is lead trained and supervisors are not allowed to do any of our work because of the union rules?" He then tells me he is going to go find another lead to bring it in and to just assist him when he arrives. So I'm like, sure, whatever. Now, it's important to note that planes have very tight metrics for how long it can take to bring a flight in, unload, and reload for the next flight. The flight pulls up to the edge of my gate and comes to a stop as there's no lead there guiding them in. So the flight just sits there, waiting. And the entire gate crew are also just standing around, waiting. 20 minutes go by, and my radio I still have on me goes off, and the office is pissed. They want to know why the heck I'm holding this flight short and not bringing it in. To which, obviously, I reply with, "What do you mean? Ex supervisor told me they couldn't afford to pay me for lead work today and that he would find someone else." He then asks me if I can please just bring it in for him, and I said, "Sorry, but if you're not willing to pay me to do the lead work, then I'm only going to do the handler work I'm being paid for." As it turns out, they sent too many leads home this night, and the ones they did have were all busy on flights already. After about 45 minutes, a lead from 2 terminals over finally strolls up and we're able to unload the plane as usual. But that 45 minutes the plane sat idle at the gate cost thousands in extra fuel plus OT for flight attendants forced into mandatory overtime from the situation. Not to mention all the passengers who were pissed off from the extra weight, who all were comps and credits with the airline for the trouble. I also come to find out the supervisor's bonus were based on flight turn time, and this 45 minutes short hold probably cost him his bonus and a write up. So basically, the too long didn't read is supervisor didn't want to pay me the $10.50 for me to be a lead for the day and instead cost the airline thousands on a heavily delayed plane at the gate and probably his yearly bonus that all could have been avoided by just paying me the extra $1.75 hour for my 6-hour shift. Sorry for any spelling and grammar errors. I'm not the best writer. Cheers. Edit. I feel I should also add that as per the company rules, only leads can bring planes in, so bringing in the flight for him while not being designated as a lead would technically also be against their rules. This is so typical. It's interesting how rules are there to be strictly enforced when it benefits the company, and then, not so important when it doesn't. That's what makes malicious compliance so magical. Following their own rules to stick it to them. There were some funny terms and insights in the comments. Let's check them out. TX said, "Good for you for being united and standing your ground. That soup was full of crap." OP replied, "Interesting choice of words." Whirly Twirly said, "Manglement at its finest." K Sorth said, "As a pilot, all I can think of is that your soup, probably cost me my commute home to see my family for $10. I would have chucked a tenner out of the escape hatch." OP replied, "Of course I felt bad for the flight crew, but blame must be placed on the billion-dollar company for refusing the $10 expense, and not the paycheck-to-paycheck bottom-level guy who needs that money for his family as well." Our third story is short but sweet. It's called Roman Numerals? Okay. When my dad was in college, he had one professor that seemed to make rules just to make life harder. Of course, it was a math-heavy class. One day, the professor asked Dad to stop by his office to discuss his work. Dad went and was very surprised. His professor complained about Dad's handwriting. Dad studied drafting, making blueprints, in high school and some previous college classes. His writing is incredible and often looks like a machine made it. It looks so machine made and perfect that I once got detention for faking his signature on a permission slip. So complaining about his handwriting was unexpected and confusing. Dad asked what he should do to make his writing more to the professor's liking. The professor said, "I don't know, use Roman numerals maybe." So Dad did all his homework using Roman numerals. Have you ever tried to write out an algebra problem using Roman numerals? It is not easy. Apparently, it is harder to grade. The professor was so upset that the dean got involved. The dean first asked what was wrong with Dad's handwriting, because it was easy to read and clear. Then the dean asked Dad why he used Roman numerals. Dad, of course, said, "I asked the professor how to improve to make my writing fit his standards, and he said to use Roman numerals. So I did." The professor grumpily admitted to saying that, and Dad was not kicked out of the class. Being rather irritating, Dad also did his income tax in Roman numerals. Who says the IRS has no sense of humor? He got a check, this was the 1960s, with his refund and a note that said, "Very funny, don't do this again." He still has it in a filing cabinet. That's so amazing. Even though it's only a few sentences at the end of the story, the IRS portion outclasses the rest. Maybe because it's so foreign nowadays to imagine the IRS or revenue agency not communicating in some soulless formulaic letter. I so wish OP would have posted a picture of the note. Let's read some comments. In response to the IRS's letter, Y Particle said, "That is the best possible response." Country Boy added, "Would have been even better if the check had been made out in Roman numerals, double malicious compliance, haha." Tax Dude said, "Back in the 1980s, I was scrutineering for an Australian election. The Senate ballot paper had 140 candidates, and under our preferential voting system in place at the time, you had to number 1 to 140 for the vote to be valid. One voter filled in the paper 1 to 140 in Roman numerals, all randomly placed across the paper. We checked the law, and there was nothing preventing this. It took us 20 minutes of searching this ballot to prove it was in order. The law was changed for the next election." And now for our final story. Shady Boss lied about my position to keep me from policy allowed benefit for years. I found out, and it changed everything. A few years ago, I worked at a big retail company and had for many years. Eventually, I went through enough grad school education to get my license to work at a higher level. Much more pay, more job satisfaction, more responsibilities, fancy title, but the job market was rough. I stayed on with my company to work in a floater position, where I would cover a large area and work at all the stores within that area on a rotating but irregular basis. Eventually, I wanted to get a staff position, where I have a single store assigned. The area was huge, the furthest store being over 100 miles from my home, and that is exactly where I was assigned to train for the new role. It was a rough store. Folks in my position were robbed and assaulted at gunpoint. Neighborhood was very unfriendly. Volume at the store was among the highest in the state. Staff turnover was, as you might expect, extreme. Well, after training, I wasn't really being scheduled to float to other stores. Once a month at most. I asked to be scheduled a little more diversely since most of the stores in my area were much closer to my home and didn't require 4 hours of driving a day. Bossman told me that I was the only floater experienced enough to handle that store. I didn't buy it. But what can you do, right? Well, a colleague told me about the mileage reimbursement policy. Floaters working at a store more than 50 miles from home can file for reimbursement of mileage over that 50 miles each way. Can even include meals. So I filled out a few of these and sent them to my boss to sign. He didn't quite refuse, but he never actually signed and filed them. I suspect as soon as I left his office at our district center, he tossed them out. Bossman tells me later that they must be lost in the system. Eventually, the same colleague showed me how to fax those same forms to accounts payable, bypassing the district bossman. So I started doing just that. One day, bossman calls me in a panic. He wants to stop my filing the forms. I asked to be floated closer to home, but he won't budge. He needs me at that miserable store. He promises me he'll make me a staff role at that store if I promise to stop faxing those forms. Staff roles are a promotion and usually come with better pay and a few other little conveniences, so I agree. Bossman says there won't be a pay bump right away, but that it'll come down the road. That never happened. 2 years later, the situation at the store has become too toxic for even me. I asked to step down from the staff position to be a floater again and be allowed to float to other stores. Bossman says that I am already a floater, never was in a staff position, but that he can't let me work at other stores because it's better for me and the customers if I stay there for familiarity. Floaters do not get scheduled to stores exclusively, so I am being singled out because they are still desperate to cover that dump of a store. I am livid, so I start looking. It took me months, but eventually I found an opportunity to make my dream career transition. I put in my formal notice, and that's when the fun started. Remember that whole mileage reimbursement policy? Well, I kept meticulous track of all my shifts, and there is no statute of limitations baked into the policy. So I started filling out those reimbursement forms to retroactively cover every single shift from the past 2 odd years. I skipped the meal part since I didn't want to go through all that effort of finding receipts. I had a friendly store manager sign off on them, and I started sending them to accounts payable directly again. I didn't fax them all in at once, but for each shift in my final 2 weeks, I faxed a few dozen in. We still have fax machines in that line of work, believe it or not. I figured, what do I have to lose? Worst case scenario, accounts payable declines the forms. On my last few shifts, I started getting the checks from accounts payable. Not added to my paycheck, but sent to me directly. Mileage reimbursements are non-taxable income, so this was all tax-free money coming to me. It must have taken a while for the charges to show up on a balance sheet, because a few weeks after my final paycheck, I got a call from my now former boss man. He wasn't happy. He got some big loss prevention manager involved, and together, they started saying I was breaking some rule by requesting the payments. They specifically claimed I was ineligible because I agreed I wouldn't be eligible in a staff position. They then threatened legal action against me if I didn't remit the full amounts back that same week. But I had the email chain from when Bossman said I was never staff and always a floater. I politely referenced that email chain before letting them know firmly that because I was lied to, our prior agreement didn't apply, and I was fully eligible all along. Corporate policy, as confirmed by HR, agreed with me, so I let them know I wasn't returning a single penny. In the end, the reimbursement amounted to well over $21,000 US, and I transitioned into my dream job. I could say that I would trade that money back for the time I lost commuting to that miserable store, 4 hours every shift, but all that pressure motivated me to making the best career move of my life. The great satisfaction of not only professionally surpassing my old boss, but getting to tell him that his lies cost him way more on the way out is almost priceless. I also shared my story and method with many colleagues who were being told wrongly by the boss man that they didn't qualify for this policy. Edit. Thank you all for the support and comments. As many of you correctly guessed, I was working as a community pharmacist. I do want to clarify that most of my coworkers, technicians, pharmacists, front end staff, and customers or patients were amazing people. Between them and my subscription to Audible with a long list of books I always wanted to read, it made the situation such that I could tolerate that commute for all that time. The job market for retail pharmacy was and is also very rough, and I can't overstate that enough. It has empowered big chains to abuse staff in this and other ways, and that also endangers patient care, not to mention staff mental health. I spent more than 10 months searching before I found an opportunity, and that involved me leaving the profession entirely. The district manager, boss man, and the store general manager, who was fully complicit in the lie, are both still working for the company last I saw. The moral of the story? Please understand your company policies and ignore any verbal agreements or HR unsupported decrees otherwise. And be kind to your pharmacy staff. The job and companies are not always kind to them. Ha! The best, that moment when HR realizes their managers have gone so far past the line, even they can't back them up. It's so sweet to hear. I love the corporate HR shutting down BS like this from a boss. The story is a perfect example of how rules and policies are selectively enforced by managers, as I said earlier. There was some further wisdom in the comments. Let's check it out. Tech Gruber said, "Not to this degree, but I've had to deal with on site managers lying to me about wages and benefits as well. Sometimes it was to make their own budgets look good. Other times it just seemed to be a personal quirk that they had to grind down people under them." Hammer replied, "Your employer is an ally of convenience, not a friend. Always look out for your own interests." Barflyer Dammit said, "I worked at a company where director level jobs got an extra week of vacation but weren't eligible for annual bonuses. I argued all the way up to C level that I should get the extra vacation. They argued that my title was director but wasn't really a director, even though I had the second largest team. So I asked for the annual bonus instead. They said that directors didn't get bonuses. 8 weeks later, I was gone after working there for 5 years. No one else in that job since has lasted more than a year. Bet that week of vacation is looking mighty cheap compared to the chaos that's been there since." Sasku said, "Remember, a promotion without a raise is not a promotion." Zero Ingenuity replied, "Not entirely true. A promotion without a raise is how your company lets you know they want your resume to look good. So be sure to polish it up and show off your new title. A promotion without a raise is just your current boss increasing the payroll costs of your next boss, who you should start looking for." If you've enjoyed the story and would like to hear more, consider liking, subscribing, and leaving a comment. Thanks, and bye for now.